At its peak, Airfix made 20 million model kits a year. The factory is an office park now, no plaque, no marker, scheduled for demolition to make way for flats. But for 30 years, that building by the River Wandle in Wandsworth smelled of sweet chemical heat from the street. And Roy Cross's paintings promised every boy in Britain that he could put the Battle of Britain on his bedroom shelf for the price of his pocket money. 75% of the British model kit market. 350,000 Spitfires made in a single 12 months. Then the decisions began. A toy company in Liverpool, already hemorrhaging when they bought it. A pram factory in South Wales rescued with £4 million and in receivership within 2 years. A debt structure that pooled the losses of everything the boardroom had collected until they swamped the one thing that actually worked. By January 1981, Airfix was bankrupt. The original moulds were shipped to France, then scattered. The very first Airfix kit, a Ferguson tractor that started everything, is gone. The first Spitfire mould is gone. What remains of the tooling is moulded in Bangalore now, softer plastic, looser fit, by a parent company whose share price has fallen from 265 pence to 32. This is the story of Nicholas Cove, who walked across Siberia and came to Wandsworth and built something that a generation of British children held in their hands and believed in, and of the decisions that, piece by piece, took it all apart. Chapter 1. The Man Who Walked Across Siberia. The story of Airfix begins, as so many British stories do, with someone who wasn't British at all. Miklos Klein was born in 1891 in the village of Anarx in the Kingdom of Hungary, a small place in a corner of Europe that had no shortage of ambition and very little room for it. By the time he reached London in the autumn of 1938, he had served as a cavalry officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, been captured by the Russians, and spent time in a prisoner of war camp near the Korean border. He escaped. He made a 4-month journey across Siberia on foot, aided by Catholic priests, reaching safety by a route that most men would not have attempted and even fewer would have survived. After the war, he briefly served as an assistant minister under Bela Kun's short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic. When that regime fell, he left for Algiers. Then Barcelona, where he ran a plastics factory until the Spanish Civil War pushed him to Milan. In Milan, he patented a process for stiffening shirt collars, which he called Interfix. In 1938, with fascism tightening across Europe, he took his wife Clotilde and their daughter Margit and moved to London. He was 47. He had a volatile temper and what his eventual business partner Ralph Ehrman would later describe, with diplomatic understatement, as a Napoleonic complex. He had also, across 7 countries and 3 decades, developed a distinctive habit. He named everything with the suffix fix. The new company he registered in 1939 he called Airfix. The air referenced the air-filled rubber goods that were his first products: swimming rings, beach balls, pneumatic cushions, rubber dolls. The fix was the pattern. Placing A at the start guaranteed prominence in trade directories. It was a practical man's branding, not a visionary's. But practical men, in Cover's experience, got considerably further. He'd changed his name too. Miklos Klein was now Nicholas Cover, another reinvention in a life that had been nothing but reinventions. The war reshaped the business almost immediately. Rubber shortages drove Cover toward plastics. The military needed belt buckles, millions of them, die-stamped in metal, and Airfix became the War Office's largest supplier. By 1947, Cove had introduced injection moulding technology to Britain, and the factory at Haldane Place was the country's largest manufacturer of plastic pocket combs. Not glamorous, not the stuff of legend, but profitable and his. The pivot into model kits arrived by accident. Around 1948, Harry Ferguson's tractor company came to Airfix with a commission, a cheap promotional model of the Ferguson TE20, the little grey Fergie, for sales representatives to carry round. Cove obliged. The model was moulded in cellulose acetate at 1:20 scale, and it was, as Ehrman later put it with characteristic dryness, so fiddly and regularly fell to bits, that someone in the room had a better idea. Sell it as a kit of parts. Let someone else have the headache of assembling it. Ferguson agreed. The kits sold at 2 shillings and 11 pence. A business was born from a product that didn't work. Cove had a cancer operation in 1950 and brought in Ehrman, recommended by the Warburg Bank, to stabilise the company. The two men couldn't have been more different, Cove volcanic and instinctive. Ehrman measured, commercially precise, and patient in the way that men who manage volatile founders learn to be. Together, they held it steady long enough to see Airfix go public in 1957 as Airfix Industries. Cove's wife Clotilde died in February 1958. He followed her on the 17th of March at his home on Finchley Road, London. Their daughter Margit inherited the company. Ehrman eventually persuaded her to retire to the south of France. Nicholas Cove never built a model aeroplane. He never sat at a dining table with a tube of polystyrene cement and assembled the thing his factory would make famous. But he built the machine that could make it. A man who had walked across Siberia and named his companies after glue, understood something about putting pieces together and making them hold. Chapter 2. 2 shillings, a bag, and a Bowen Drake. The transformation from comb manufacturer to cultural institution rested on one buyer, one impossible price point, and a decision about packaging that was born entirely from desperation. Jim Rewson was a buyer at F.W. Woolworths. Around 1952, he came to Airfix with a proposal: produce a model kit of Sir Francis Drake's Golden Hind. Woolworths would stock it nationally. The condition was brutal. The kit couldn't sell for more than 2 shillings. Airfix had been pricing in the 5 shilling range. Russon's ceiling wasn't a negotiating position. It was the wall. John Gray, the aviation enthusiast Cove had hired as general manager in 1949, found the answer in the packaging. Not a cardboard box, a polystyrene bag with a paper header card. The header card serving as the instruction sheet on its reverse. This slashed packaging cost so dramatically that Woolworth's price point became not just achievable, but comfortable. The Golden Hind sold in enormous numbers. The format became Airfix's signature for decades. The see-through bag on the wire rack, the illustrated header card, a pocket money purchase for any child in Britain with a few coins and a Saturday afternoon to fill. The first aircraft kit, a 1/72nd scale Supermarine Spitfire, followed in 1955. Airfix would long claim 1953, a small historical embellishment that eventually hardened into mythology. Researcher Stephen Pietrobon, working through factory tool logs decades later, established that the tooling was cut in September 1955. The scale was chosen to fit the existing moulding machines. As it happened, 1/72nd also matched the scale used for wartime aircraft recognition models, meaning every RAF veteran who'd spent the war identifying silhouettes from shadow charts already had an intuitive spatial relationship with it. The choice was accidental and perfect simultaneously. Cove himself was hostile to the aircraft idea. He threatened to charge the tooling costs personally to his design team. He was wrong, and the numbers would eventually prove it beyond dispute. 2 more people shaped what followed. Ralph Ehrman championed the switch from cellulose acetate to American-imported polystyrene, a materials decision that sounds technical and was, in practice, transformative. Cellulose acetate warped. Polystyrene held its shape, took detail cleanly, and cemented reliably. And John Edwards, a modeller who had initially contacted Airfix to complain about inaccuracies in the Spitfire kit, was hired as chief designer after convincing the company he could produce better work. He could. Edwards directed kit designs across multiple ranges for 15 years until his death at 38 years old, around 1970. He never saw what his designs had become. By 1961, nearly 100 kits were in the range. By 1966, 200 across 13 themes. By 1968, more than 250 kits across 19 ranges. The Woolworths relationship deepened to the point where Woolworths produced its own personalised Airfix catalogues from 1958, tailored to their own customers. The entire commercial engine of the business was built around the idea that a child with loose change could walk into the most common high street shop in Britain and walk out holding a piece of the past. The factory at Haldane Place, near the River Wandle in Earlsfield, was where all of it was made. It was not a romantic building. It was a functional, heavy, purposeful place on a stretch of South London that had been built up and built over for a century. The same patch of industrial ground that had once housed the Columbia Gramophone Company, that smelled of work before you'd reached the front gates. Airfix had moved in and, step by step, turned it into something that meant considerably more than its exterior suggested. Chapter 3. The Factory by the River Wandle. In 1968, a British Pathé crew came to Haldane Place to document how plastic kits were made. What they found was an ordinary miracle, the kind of miracle that only becomes visible once it's gone. The injection moulding machines dominated the production floor. Each one housed a steel mould tool weighing approximately 700 kilograms, precision cut to produce miniature aircraft wings, fuselage halves, turrets, undercarriage legs, the constituent parts of something that, once assembled, would look like the real thing at 1/72nd the scale. The hydraulic clamp closed with mechanical force. Molten polystyrene, heated, viscous, carrying that sweet chemical odour that Airfix workers described as something you could smell from the street, was injected under high pressure into the steel cavities. The mould opened with a pneumatic hiss. And out came the sprue, still warm, still slightly flexible, a Christmas tree arrangement of grey plastic parts, connected by runners. Each part exactly formed. Each one a piece of something larger. Freshly moulded sprues were broken into cardboard trays, stacked in tea chests, carried to the packing room. The Pathé footage shows what happened next. Mostly young women seated at long benches, assembling each kit with instruction sheets, clear display stands, and return slips before taping the packaging shut. One local resident, who visited the site as a 10-year-old in the 1950s, recalled rummaging the factory's bins for Spitfire parts. By the early 1970s, this factory and the machinery inside it were producing 20 million kits a year. Airfix held 75% of the British model kit market. In a single peak year, 350,000 Spitfires were made at Haldane Place, 80,000 Hurricanes, 60,000 Lancasters. Up to 17 new kit toolings were being released annually. The product range ran to more than 300 kits. None of those kits would have looked the way they looked without Roy Cross. Cross was born in Camberwell on the 23rd of April, 1924, and was largely self-taught as an artist. He'd left art school, he later said, because they couldn't teach me to draw planes. During the war, he'd worked as a technical illustrator for Fairey Aviation, producing cutaway training manuals for aircraft that were actively in service. He spotted Airfix's bagged kits in a Woolworths store around 1963, studied the rudimentary line drawings printed on the header cards, and walked directly to the company. His first commission was the Dornier Do 217 in 1964. Over the following decade, Cross painted more than 200 Airfix box tops in gouache and oil, a body of work that most people who held those bags as children absorbed without ever knowing an artist's name. Lancasters limbing home with engines ablaze against a bruised night sky. Fokker triplanes wheeling through the smoke of a First World War dogfight. Sunderland flying boats catching morning light above a churned Atlantic Sea. Each painting was researched with the seriousness of a historian. For the Spitfire's elliptical wing profile, Cross corresponded directly with Beverly Shenstone, the aerodynamicist who had designed that wing. His favourite works included the B-26 Marauder, which he described as a pure work of art, and the 1/32nd Spitfire. His last Airfix commission was the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, completed in 1974. Much of the original artwork was later destroyed. All that survives of much of it are the printed lids of boxes that are themselves decaying in attics. Roy Cross died on the 24th of April, 2024, the day after his 100th birthday. His paintings still sell Airfix kits today. A child standing at the Woolworths rack in 1971, turning a bag over in their hands, wasn't just choosing a hobby. They were choosing which sky they wanted to inhabit. Cross understood this. He didn't paint aircraft. He painted the experience of being inside them, of being the pilot of that Spitfire, of feeling the hurricane's controls go light as the enemy turned and you turned with him. The box was the promise. The kit was what you did to keep it. The cultural reach of the brand by the mid-1970s was total. Historian Arthur Ward observed that only a very sad minority of men aged 30 to 50 had not made Airfix kits as boys. The name had become generic. An Airfix kit meant any plastic model kit, the way Hoover meant any vacuum cleaner. Components from the Airfix range appeared in the original Star Wars in 1977. Incorporated by Elstree Studios staff into the Millennium Falcon miniatures used in long shots. Eric Morecambe was filmed completing the 1/24th Spitfire in a television sketch. Dick Emery served as president of the Airfix Modelers Club, and the smell of polystyrene cement, sweet, specific, faintly chemical, had lodged itself in the memory of a generation in a way that no other consumer product quite managed. 30 years on, a man could catch a trace of it in a hobby shop and be back at a dining table in seconds, newspaper spread beneath his elbows, fingers tacky with glue, his father reading the Sunday paper in the armchair behind him. You can't manufacture that. Not deliberately. It arrived as a side effect of making good things cheaply and putting them in the hands of children for decades. Haldane Place had done something the executives who ran Airfix Industries could not quite see. It had become a place of memory before anyone had thought to protect it. Chapter 4. The Queen's Award and the Iceberg. In 1971, Airfix received the Queen's Award to Industry for Export Achievement. It was the summit, the highest point the company would ever reach. And 1971 was the same year Ralph Ehrman made the decision that would eventually bring everything down. Lines Brothers had been, until recently, the world's largest toy company. 40 subsidiaries worldwide. Products on every continent. Then it collapsed, comprehensively, without ceremony, and its remaining assets went to auction. Airfix moved quickly. For £2,740,000, they acquired Meccano Limited and Dinky Toys, making Airfix Industries the largest toy manufacturer in the United Kingdom at a stroke. Ehrman presented it as triumph. It had the appearance of triumph. Meccano was one of the foundational British toy brands. The metal construction system manufactured at the Binns Road factory in Liverpool since 1901. The thing that had put engineering instincts into boys' hands for 3 generations. Dinky was the die-cast vehicle range that had defined the toy car market before any other name was in the conversation. On paper, Airfix had just acquired 2 pillars of British childhood. What the paper didn't show was that both were already failing. The Binns Road factory was antiquated. Parts of it, as an MP would later note in Parliament, belonged in a museum rather than a modern production plant. Meccano had been losing money for years. Dinky faced competition it couldn't answer. Corgi and Matchbox on one side, cheap Far Eastern imports on the other, undercutting any British price point while still returning a margin. The kit business at Haldane Place was still profitable. The 20 million kits were still selling. Roy Cross's box art was still pulling children toward the Woolworths rack. None of that had changed. But the company that made those kits was now carrying 2 failing brands it hadn't built and couldn't repair. The debt structure was changing. And in the factory at Haldane Place, on the production floor where the presses ran and the sprues came out warm, nobody knew yet what had been loaded onto the ship alongside them. The hydraulic clamps were still closing. The polystyrene was still flowing. The Spitfires were still being made. Chapter 5. The Gathering Weather. The world outside Haldane Place was changing in ways that a model kit factory could not easily absorb. In October 1973, OPEC cut oil production and the price of crude quadrupled in a matter of weeks. Polystyrene is a petroleum derivative. The raw material that Airfix bought by the ton, that flowed molten through the machines at Haldane Place 18 hours a day, became suddenly significantly more expensive. Margins that had looked comfortable looked rather less so. The company absorbed it. It had no choice. 3 years later, the pound sterling collapsed. In the space of months, the exchange rate against the dollar moved from $1.56 to over $2.35, a shift that destroyed Airfix's export competitiveness almost overnight. The kits that had been selling well in America at American price points were now priced out of their market. Ehrman, who had built much of the commercial strategy around exports, watched the currency do what no competitor had managed. And the competitors were becoming formidable. From Japan, Tamiya and Hasegawa were setting quality standards that Airfix's tooling, designed in the 1950s and 1960s and worn progressively thinner with each moulding cycle, was struggling to match. The fit of a Tamiya kit's parts was noticeably tighter. The surface detail was crisper. The instructions were clearer. British modellers, who had been loyal to Airfix because there had been nothing else worth considering, now had something else worth considering. Italy's Italeri was making inroads. Matchbox, the domestic competitor, was chipping away at the lower end of the range. Then, in 1978, Space Invaders arrived in British arcades. Boys who had spent Saturday afternoons at the dining table, newspaper spread beneath their elbows, fingers tacky with polystyrene cement, now had somewhere else to put their leisure time and their pocket money. The shift was not sudden. It was gradual, and once it started, irreversible. None of this, singly, would have killed Airfix. The kit business at Haldane Place was still profitable. Boys were still building. Woolworths was still stocking. Roy Cross's paintings were still doing their work on the wire racks. What would kill Airfix was what it was carrying. Meccano's Binns Road factory in Liverpool was losing more than £1 million a year by the mid-1970s. The dinky brand was hemorrhaging against competition it could not match. A rescue of Triang pedigree, a pram and doll manufacturer in Merthyr Tydfil, had been approved in 1975 with government backing and a £4 million injection. By 1977, Triang pedigree was in receivership anyway. The money was simply gone. By 1979, Airfix Industries was a profitable hobby company buckled under the weight of unprofitable companies it had agreed to carry. Ehrman was 71 years old. Chapter 6. 4 o'clock. On a Friday. The first thing to break was Liverpool. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of Friday the 30th of November, 1979, 3 weeks before Christmas, during an afternoon shift, Airfix Industries issued dismissal notices to the entire workforce at the Meccano factory on Binns Road. By 5 o'clock, the factory doors were locked. Workers with 30 and 40 years of service were told not to return. 943 jobs, eliminated in less than an hour, in an area where unemployment was already running at 11.4%, and where the odds of a general labourer finding work were, as one MP calculated in the subsequent parliamentary debate, 222 to 1 against. No advance warning had been given, not to the workers, not to the trade unions, not to the government, which was notified by a director of Airfix the same afternoon, after the factory gates were already shut. The Employment Protection Act required 90 days statutory notice. Airfix gave none. When MP David Alton met the Airfix board on the 12th of December, he found a company that showed, in his words, about as much compassion as a 20th century Scrooge. Alton had seen the letters from workers. He had spoken to families in his constituency who had received no severance, no warning, nothing but a dismissal notice handed across a factory floor at the start of a winter weekend. Ehrman was reached by telephone. He acknowledged, with what seemed to pass in the boardroom for candour, that the closure had been done in a harsh manner. But his company, he said, had no choice. Parliamentary questions over the following weeks uncovered the full dimensions of the wreckage. Government aid to Meccano over 5 years had totalled more than £2.7 million. A modernisation grant of £787,500 had been offered as recently as February 1978, of which £210,000 had already been paid out. A certificate of viability, a formal document affirming Meccano's future as a going concern, had been signed in May 1979, 6 months before the closure. The company had still been installing new machinery and taking on new staff the week before the doors were locked. Workers' telephones were disconnected. Gas and electricity supplies were threatened. MP Ogden's official parliamentary mail sent to workers at the factory was intercepted and withheld by Airfix management, an act so brazen it required intervention by the Liverpool head postmaster to resolve. Parliament described Airfix Industries as a two-man managed company. Ehrman and a figure identified in Hansard only as Mr. Sinaglia had been running a business with more than 2,000 employees and multiple manufacturing sites as though it were still a small Wandsworth plastics firm with a sideline in Combs. The kits at Haldane Place kept moving through the machines. The presses kept closing. The sprues kept coming out warm. But something irreversible had happened in Liverpool, and the weight of it was now pressing down on everything. Chapter 7. The bankers take the best of it. Through 1980, the reckoning arrived in stages. Meccano's losses, combined with the strengthened pound destroying what remained of export markets, brought Airfix's bankers to the table. The conversations that followed had a particular brutal arithmetic. The company was overextended and undercapitalised. Assets would need to be sold to service the debt. Which assets? Not Meccano, which had nothing left to sell. Not Dinky, which was worth little. The bankers identified Airfix's two most profitable divisions, the ones that had nothing to do with model kits, the ones that nobody outside the city associated with the Airfix name. Airfix Plastics, which supplied Marks and Spencer and Habitat with crayon bathroom accessories designed by Terence Conran, and Declon, another industrial plastics operation. A Midlands engineering conglomerate called McKechnie bought them both. The price was £47 million. £47 million for the bathroom accessories, for the industrial plastics divisions that no child had ever heard of, that no boy had ever held in his hands at a Woolworths rack, that carried none of the brand weight, none of the cultural resonance, none of the 30 years of accrued nostalgia that the name Airfix represented. The famous toy business, the Spitfires, the Lancasters, the Hurricanes, the Roy Cross paintings, the 20 million kits a year, the smell of polystyrene cement in the Haldane Place factory. That was the part drowning in red ink. What had been stripped away to pay the debts was worth £47 million. What remained was not. Chapter 8. Earl's Court, January 1981. The Earl's Court Toy Fair ran each January. The toy industry gathered there to see what was coming. The new ranges, the new toolings, the new ideas that would fill the racks by Easter. In January 1981, Airfix Industries used the fair to announce that it would cease trading. The model kit range itself had not failed. The 20 million kits were not a fiction. Children were still buying. The Woolworths relationship was still intact. But the financial structure of the conglomerate meant that the losses of Meccano and Dinky and Triang Pedigree had pulled together into something that pulled against the profitable core until the core could no longer hold. The machines at Haldane Place stopped. The presses that had been closing and opening since before the Festival of Britain, that had produced hundreds of millions of sprues over 3 decades, went still. The smell of hot polystyrene, sweet, chemical, specific, dissipated. The packing room, where mostly young women had sat at long benches assembling instruction sheets and return slips and plastic bags, emptied out. 943 workers in Liverpool had already been told not to come back. Now London's turn. The London Gazette published the creditors' petition to wind up Airfix products on the 4th of June 1981. Airfix Industries was formally wound up on the 2nd of August 1982. The liquidators were not discharged until the 22nd of April 1987. 6 years of administrative aftermath, measured out in legal notices, to mark the end of something that had taken 30 years to build. No ceremony, no plaque. The site at Haldane Place, where the Ferguson Tractor Commission had arrived 40 years earlier and started everything, was converted into an office park. Chapter 9. The moulds that crossed the channel. What happened next to the steel mould tools? Those 700-kilogram blocks of precision-cut cavities, each one the physical record of an aircraft or a ship or a soldier, is a story that moves across 3 countries, 5 owners and 2 decades. General Mills moved first. The Minneapolis Food Company, whose UK subsidiary Palitoy made Action Man in Colville, Leicestershire, acquired the Airfix brand and the tooling from the bankruptcy. The moulds were crated and shipped from Haldane Place across the Channel to Palitoy's facility in Calais, France. Airfix aircraft kits appeared in America under the MPC label. MPC car kits and Star Wars models came back the other way, reboxed with the Airfix name for British shelves. The brand's UK market share fell from 75% to roughly 40%. No new Airfix toolings were released for 2 years. In 1986, General Mills decided food was more profitable than toys and sold the hobby products group to Borden Inc., the American corporation that made Elmer's glue and also owned Humbrol model paints in Hull and a French kit manufacturer called Heller SA, based in Troon, in Normandy. The moulds travelled again, from Calais to Troon, where they would sit for the next 20 years. In 1994, Borden sold the group to an Irish private equity firm called Allen & Maguire, which operated it under the Humbrol name from Hull. Trevor Snowden, an Airfix employee, was eventually dispatched to Troon to take stock of what remained. What he found told a story that no accountant had recorded. Years of open storage had warped and rusted tools that no one had bothered to protect. Some had been permanently modified, the DC-3/C-47 converted into an AC-47 gunship, the RAF. Hercules retooled into an AC-130, configurations destroyed and irreplaceable. Some were simply gone. The Ferguson TE-20 tractor mould, the very first Airfix kit, the one that had started the whole thing when it fell apart in the hands of Harry Ferguson's sales representatives, was confirmed lost. Almost certainly scrapped during the 1981 bankruptcy, when nobody in the liquidation process was thinking about historical significance. The original Spitfire BTK mould, the one that Cove had threatened to charge to his designers, the first aircraft kit, the one from which 350,000 Spitfires had been made in a single peak year, gone. Confirmed by Snowden. Gone. The Fireball XL5 mould, the Stingray, the Aston Martin DB5, the B-17G Flying Fortress, worn beyond repair. The Wellington. A dozen car kits, including the Austin Maxi and the Morris Marina, damaged beyond use from years of outdoor storage during the Palitoy era. As many as 44 different companies across the decades would use Airfix moulds under various licensing arrangements. The tools passed from hand to hand like estate sale furniture, some recognised for what they were, most not. In November 2006, Hornby Hobbies, the Margate-based model railway company, acquired Airfix and Humbrol for £2.6 million. Combined annual sales had been £6.5 million the previous year. The brand that had been worth enough to run a quarter of the British toy market in 1971 changed hands for less than the price of a modest office development. CEO Frank Martin declared himself delighted. The moulds came home, to Hornby's warehouse, not to Haldane Place, which by then was an office park. Chapter 10. Bangalore builds Spitfires now. Airfix kits today are designed in Margate. The mould tools are cut in China. The injection moulding is done in Bangalore, India. The final packaging happens somewhere in Britain. The chain that produces a Spitfire now stretches across 3 countries that share neither a language nor a working relationship that modelers on the Airfix forum would describe as functional. One quality professional with detailed knowledge of the supply chain described the structural problem with the precision of someone who had watched it go wrong repeatedly. The kit is designed in the UK, the mould is cut in China, the moulding is done in India, and because the Chinese and Indian operations won't communicate with each other, any problem that emerges between tooling and production goes uncorrected. The UK end has no leverage over either. The plastic is softer. Modellers who build vintage kits alongside modern ones know to eat it immediately. The older UK moulded polystyrene cuts differently, holds a painted edge more crisply, behaves in the hand like a material that knows what it is. One modeller tracking his own builds recorded severe short-shot defects, parts that hadn't fully filled the mould during injection, in 6 of his last 25 Airfix kits. In 34 consecutive Tamiya kits, he recorded 0. The nuance matters, because not all modern Airfix is the same. New toolkits, designed with KD software since 2009, can be genuinely excellent. The 1/72nd F35B was described by one reviewer as unbelievably good for the price. The 1/48th Avro Anson drew the word flawless from a modeler not given to exaggeration. An Airfix employee acknowledged on the company's own forum that the old tools were being phased out as fast as a small team could manage, 60 new moulds in 5 years, but the inherited stock of worn-out 1960s tooling was large, and the distance between the design office and the moulding floor was very long. In 2022, Airfix made a gesture that revealed exactly how much had changed. For the new 1-24 Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9C, the company commissioned UK manufacturing, the first Airfix Spitfire moulded in Britain since the 1980s. Dale Luckhurst, head of brand, acknowledged that the decision was symbolic as much as commercial. It just felt right to make such a British icon in Britain. The kit retailed at £94.99. The public reaction caught the dilemma with precision. Enthusiasm for British manufacturing colliding with the reality that British-made means British-priced. And many families cannot stretch to nearly £100 for a model kit regardless of what it represents. Hornby P. LC's share price, meanwhile, has fallen from 265 pence a decade ago to roughly 32 pence. In February 2026, the company sold Scalextric to Purbeck Capital for £20 million to reduce its debt. Mike Ashley's Frasers Group holds a stake. Hornby's own internal assessment concedes that the brand serves existing, loyal customers well but has seen no meaningful growth. The people who grew up building Airfix kits are in their 50s and 60s. The children who might replace them are somewhere else. What happens to a brand when the generation that loved it is the last generation that loved it? Chapter 11. What Haldane Place remembers. The factory is still standing, for now. It was converted into the Riverside Business Centre after the bankruptcy. Offices, studios, meeting rooms, the ordinary commerce of a South London industrial-to-office conversion. Companies registered at Companies House still list their address as the old Airfix factory, Riverside Business Centre, business. The wider site includes, among other things, London's largest trampoline park. No blue plaque marks what happened there. No Heritage Interpretation Board explains to people parking their cars that this patch of ground produced 20 million things a year that shaped how a generation understood the past. A local walking guide notes, in passing, that Airfix Industries made plastic kits here in the 1950s and 1970s. That's what survives of the official memory. A resident posting online in 2023 remembered coming to this street as a 10-year-old in the 50s, rummaging the bins for Spitfire parts. That's the unofficial memory, more vivid, more specific, closer to the truth. In 2009, James May built a life-size Spitfire for BBC's Toy Stories, an 11.2-metre wingspan model kit at 1:1 scale, assembled from scratch, earning a Guinness World Record for the largest model kit aircraft ever constructed. He named it Haldane Place. It bears the original BTK Squadron markings from the first 1955 Spitfire kit. It lives now at the RAF Museum in Cosford. After the programme aired, a model shop manager reported that the broadcast generated 4 months' worth of kit sales in a single week. The building that the model was named after is scheduled for demolition. Workspace Management Limited has submitted plans to replace the Riverside Business Centre with 353 new homes in blocks rising to 14 stories, with a riverside walkway to King George's Park. Planning objections have been filed. No organised campaign to preserve or mark the Airfix heritage at the site has yet taken hold. Somewhere in Hornby's warehouse, racks of old steel mould tools still carry the shapes that John Edwards designed before he died at 38. The shapes that Roy Cross's paintings promised. The shape of a Spitfire wing at 1/72nd scale, cut in steel in the mid-1950s, that has survived 3 countries and 5 corporate bankruptcies, and open-air storage in a Norman barnyard and 44 different owners. The original mould is gone. But something of what it made persists. Roy Cross painted more than 200 box tops for a company that no longer exists, for a factory that is about to be demolished, for a brand that now makes its kits in Bangalore. He died the day after his 100th birthday. His paintings still sell kits on shelves in hobby shops today, half a century after he last touched a brush for Airfix. The Lancasters still limp home with their engines ablaze. The Spitfires are still turning hard into the light. Nicholas Cove walked across Siberia and came to Wandsworth and built something from hot polystyrene and pocket money that 3 generations of British children held in their hands and believed in. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, rather a lot.